Your film is now ready to be shown.
Good morning. I'm Justin Hendricks, editor of Tech Policy Press, a nonprofit media venture intended to provoke new ideas, debate, and discussion at the intersection of technology and democracy. On August 26th, I had the opportunity to moderate a panel convened by the Social Science Research Council at its offices in Brooklyn, New York. The panel was titled Platforms and Elections, the Global State of Play, and it featured three prominent academics, including Dr. Shannon McGregor, who's an associate professor at the UNC Hussman School of Journalism and Media and a principal investigator with the Center for Information, Technology, and Public Life, or CITAP, Dr. Jonathan Corpus Ong, who's a professor of global digital media at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and inaugural director of the Global Technology for Social Justice Lab, and Dr. Chris Tenove, research associate and instructor at the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs and assistant director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions at the University of British Columbia. What follows is a lightly edited recording of the conversation, which touches on topics ranging from the role of civil society and independent researchers in engaging with efforts to protect the integrity of elections and mitigate the spread of mis and disinformation, to current questions about how generative AI may impact politics.
We all know it's an important year, and we are about to enter a very hot and heavy period of politics in this country as we head into the November election. A lot has already happened. We've had India, we've had France, we've had the UK, we've had Indonesia, we've had many other elections around the world. First thoughts, best thoughts, top of mind. When you came here tonight, what did you know you wanted to talk about? And Shannon McGregor, I'll give you that start.
Thank you for having me and for convening this. I think one of the things that I wanted to talk about is a little bit of framing for our discussion. Don't think it's necessarily news to a lot of people in this room or the listeners, but I think it's a good, important reminder that I have to remind myself of sometimes. So that's why I'm saying it. Is that as we talk about the intersection of whether it's elections and media and social media, or even just politics and media and social media, nothing is ever all good or all bad, right? And the same things that many of us do important, I think, very critical work on to show the issues of, say, extremism and other forms of hate that are being exacerbated by certain affordances of platforms or platforms writ large or media systems are those very same platforms and tools that also make it possible for liberatory and progressive movements to happen. And so I think that's the thing that I'm always thinking about. When I started researching social media, first of all, everyone said Twitter didn't matter and I shouldn't research it when I started my PhD. And so then there was this period of now it's like changing everything and it's all good. And now it's become this boogeyman. I never thought I would be in a position where I was spending a fair amount of my career like defending social media and social media platforms. But I find that I am, because I think we have, as a society, and society has often been too quick to criticize, rightfully so, for the problems that are exacerbated by them, but at the detriment of recognizing all of the very good and wonderful things that have also been afforded by those same platforms.
Jonathan, I'll give you the same prompt. First thoughts, best thoughts. I think of your research as having complicated our understanding of issues like disinformation, misinformation in a range of different ways, but mostly by also looking at some of the labor issues and the kind of broader social issues that are underlying some of these problems that some folks associate with platforms. What's top of mind for you?
So as someone who enters platform studies, critical tech studies from a more global perspective, I think about what does tech justice and tech accountability really look like from the perspective of the global South. Or we use the term global majority as a more empowering term for people to define themselves outside of being seen as an ethnic minority within global North countries, right? So what does that look like in terms of programs? What needs to be funded? What are the key priorities from global South, global majority countries? But also not just in terms of like programming, also like the ways of working and collaboration, what kinds of like new agenda and concepts should we like advance that will truly center and benefit the global majority. So there's a way in which some of this debate, as someone who comes at it from a qualitative perspective. And I think it's cool that we have a more qualitative panel here as well. I often don't feel like I fit in some of the more legal debates. And I think that's very valuable to have to think through the precise like legal frameworks that could hold platforms accountable. But if we involve civil society organizations, like frontline workers who are actually doing some of those interventions on the ground, what will they say, right? What will be some of the key programs that they feel are underfunded or not prioritized, not included in that tech accountability frame? So my colleagues and I have been doing this, as you mentioned, Justin, a South-to-South knowledge exchange project. We first started with a comparison with Brazil and Philippines, but then expanded this conversation with folks from India, also from Moldova, Indonesia, to weigh in on some of those programs. And just to preview, and I'm happy to discuss this much more. Like a lot of like when funders ask me, so what should be funded, right? A lot of the civil society workers will start from the ways of working, like the coalitions, like the kinds of people included in the room. And we actually can't be heard within those spaces. So we can even tell you what are our programs, what our projects should be. Yeah, and more later.
Okay, we've got a lot to get into there, especially when we start to think about the role of civil society in holding platforms to account or engaging on election issues. I know that's something we want to dive into. But Chris, to come to you, Jonathan brought up legal regulatory frameworks. I know you're thinking about that. And you come from Canada, a country which does pass laws and has a functioning government. What's it like there?
Thank you very much. I am thinking about the regulatory frameworks that we're applying to platforms, especially in election contexts these days. And part of that is at the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. We're doing a project that is bringing in collaborators like Jonathan and Shannon to get different perspectives on how this plays out in different ways and in different parts of the world. And there is this shift of recent years from the kind of techlash and the real concerns about what platforms are doing to efforts by governments to step in and create laws or other types of regulatory frameworks. So we're really curious about how that's coming. And elections are a great time to look at that because really high stakes, and also helps illuminate the concerns we might have about the misuse of these regulatory approaches in order to influence who wins elections and who doesn't. So those kind of things are on my mind. And we've also recently put out a new report called Harmful Hallucinations that's on generative AI and elections. So that's something that we are thinking about. And we're thinking about it in Canada, which is a place that passes laws on things, although it's Canada's frameworks for both platform governance broadly and AI governance are works in progress at the moment, before Parliament, but not passed. But still, we have seen some kind of incremental developments on regulating platforms and elections that we haven't seen as much of here in the US.
I want to dive into this question around the role of civil society in platform accountability, particularly when it comes to elections. And I want to start with you, Jonathan, because I know you've been looking at this. You mentioned Brazil, the Philippines, places where there has been effort to build coalition, to think about these issues headed into election cycles. And I think in both places, we've seen how fraught that is, how complicated it is. And some of that's playing out right now in the news in Brazil, as we see this battle between Elon Musk and the judge there who's played such a role in making content removal requests to the platforms. But how do you think about this thing that's happened over the last few years? We see it in so many different election contexts where civil society groups have to band together to try to protect elections or to address various harms that they see occurring on these platforms.
Sure. Focusing on the question on the in-country context first, right? And so I think there's ways in which like we can compare one country with another. And I think that's really where our curiosity as someone from the Philippines, like myself, and I see also one other colleague who's a journalist in our audience today, implementing like journalistic interventions and fact-checking. And so that's very important to think about what can we learn from Brazil, where they did something right for Lula to have won the election. In the Philippines, we had elected the son of a former dictator. And so, like, thinking about both countries with histories of authoritarian leadership and authoritarian nostalgia, but one country did something right. So that was a question that really prompted a lot of our research. And obviously, like, what civil society did is like one factor, right? Like, obviously, the politicians and the actual conduct of the campaigns that politicians use, and whether they were able to have like a bigger audience in terms of their kinds of advertising and grassroots outreach, that should be seen as something important to study. But we look at what civil society did. So at that level, we were able to find that in the Philippines context, and it might have a lot to do in our research, our ongoing comparative research looks at the funding structures. A lot of our coalitions were very methodologically singular, like it was very journalism and fact-checking focused. While in Brazil, it seemed like a much broader, diverse coalition that applied different kinds of strategic litigation, looking at the funding structures and advertising technology, for example, like also using the courts to their advantage. And so they had more levers to play with. So I think that's something that we could learn as a specific country. But it also begs a broader question of a lot of the debates, especially for global majority countries, we don't often feel seen or valued by platforms, right? Like when we will have a big legislative hearing, like the platforms won't even show up, right? Like even like with big scandals and revelations. So it begs the question of like, how can we make a case for the global majority? Should it be like more regional, cross country when it comes to making a case that you were able to provide all these tools to the global north when it comes to monitoring advertising, for example, or looking at different kinds of tools afforded to civil society, but you don't do that in the global south. But our argument in our report is that's a first step to look at like inequities in terms of what tools, what data can the global majority access versus what the global north. But we should think beyond just these terms, because we often just look at the platforms and engage them on their own terms, and our energies and our resources are diverted actually from being more critical.
Shannon, I want to come back to you, and also maybe picking up on this point about role of civil society, but also role of researchers in studying these issues. You just produced a book along with many colleagues about January 6th and the kind of role of media and social media in that phenomenon, that event. You're studying issues around the fragmentation of the media and information ecosystem and how that's playing out in our political discourse. What do you think of the role of civil society in thinking about platform accountability, but also maybe the role of researchers within that as well?
I think there's a really important role, and to Jonathan's point, this accountability from global majority countries and global majority civil society groups is really important. I think especially because platforms are not getting it right in the global north, right? It's not going well, right? If they can't get it right here, then like, how can we ever, right? And so I think if this is an all hands on deck moment, you know what I mean? I guess is what I'm trying to say, both this accountability and also still pushing from within the sort of researcher community in this sort of global north situation as well. I think there's a couple of things that are really important in terms of the role of researchers. And then I'll say something about the fragmentation in a minute. And I think it's really interesting to think about what is our role. On the one hand, like I think we tend to think if we're researchers and we want to make some impact in terms of like platform policy or whatever, that we do something very publicly. We write an op-ed and that's good, right? That does something too. But what I have learned over the course of my own career and my colleagues is that there's really an important role within platform and platform policy in terms of the research that we produce being really useful for advocates within platforms. To be able to make the case. Often outside research is seen as much more important and influential. And so like literally just still doing the research and making sure that, of course, some people and platforms can access that. I think I've learned it's been a really important tool. And I would say the same for lawmakers as well, right? In different sort of legislative bodies here in the US as well. I have in my own experience, I found that folks struggle to understand how it can be useful. But then when they see it, they're like, oh, that is very useful for us thinking about, this policy. So I think that's one role of researchers. I think another role of researchers, but also civil society groups and especially activist groups, is I think public shaming is really compelling. I think we've gotten to a point where we're a little bit scared of it. And I actually don't think we should be. In the wonderful words of my dear friend and colleague, Dean Freelon, not particularly in this context, but I think it fits, racists should feel bad again. And I think that's in terms of platforms, right? The having this sort of public shaming of this is wrong when things are wrong, I do think can be important. I think at the same time that we have to also celebrate with the same sort of loud voice when things are good. Speaking about this idea of fractured politics and this fractured media and social media space that we're in, especially in terms of how it overlaps with the research situation, there's just more platforms, right? There's more platforms when we think about social media. There's also more just media channels, whether we're talking about radio or online or television or cable. Some benefits of that is, as a researcher, you can have a specialization. One of the things that we have that we're seeing both at our center, CITAP, but also other centers is a real growing movement within communication and media scholarship of a focus on the far right, for example, right? And so you can have this specialization, which allows you to just do better, right, at your work because you have this specialization. It can also, I think, the way that the media system is fractured, I think allows us to have a clear analysis of power and what the stakes of things really are. In a way that was a little bit easier to hedge when things were not quite as fractured. I'm not saying that's worth it necessarily, but it does at least give us that. But there are drawbacks, right? Some of this fragmentation means it's a lot harder to study, right? Both data access perspective, but even just understanding the multitude, right, of different channels and different platforms that we have. But I also think one of the drawbacks is that it sometimes makes it harder that some then struggle to diagnose the problem of what is actually going on, because at least speaking in the US context, we don't have extremism because of social media. We don't have extremism because of Fox News necessarily either, right? That is not the problem. This is a social problem. It has historical roots. This all exists within the context of everything that came before us, right? And I was thinking about this when you mentioned fact checking, right? Because I feel like we've really lost the plot on fact checking, at least here in the US context, where initially it was this tool, a really important thing, which is journalism should be reporting the truth. And when things are false, then we correct them. And okay, right? My dad was a journalist. I was a journalist. I teach journalism. Yeah, I'm on board with that. But simply correcting individual facts without the context of the things around them actually, I think, does a greater disservice to the truth as we think about it than if we didn't have that kind of narrow and contextless fact checking. And I think that is one of the things that we've seen the mainstream media respond to some of the media fragmentation with, is this sort of defensive fact checking on these narrow things that, I don't know, I think frankly don't actually matter and certainly don't make any impact beyond making people like me mad, and you and my family have to listen to me yell at NPR every morning when I listen to it.
Chris, I'll come to you again on the kind of maybe some of the regulatory threads of what Jonathan and Shannon are talking about. When you think about what different regulatory regimes have done to try to institutionalize or create law around how to involve civil society or how to ensure that research is done around social media and platforms. What are you seeing in the world? Are there things to admire?
Big picture, in surveying some of what's happening right now in terms of policies and regulations focused on platforms and elections, the EU and Brazil are in some ways these really interesting protagonists with different approaches, but taking innovative and quite strong action on the issue. And so the DSA is part of a larger EU effort under a democratic action plan of a few years now, developed by the European Commission in order to try and both shift platform governance in pretty major ways and deal with these problems around disinformation and some other issues. And their approach really emphasizes transparency, including enabling more data access for researchers. A lot of work, including recent European Parliament legislation around political ads, transparency around advertising, accountability. So not just being able to have more information to know what platforms are doing, but clearer standards for what they're doing. Some of those will be legal about action must be taken on illegal content, but also this really innovative approach to looking at very large online platforms and setting expectations around the content to deal with systemic issues, including on elections and civic discourse. And a lot to say about what that looked like in the European Parliament elections we've just had. And then also some work that Europe is supporting on encouraging, supporting fact-checking and other sorts of things. But there we're seeing the European Commission put together these like big frameworks. Efforts are going through the parliaments, so through the European level legislature. By contrast, in Brazil, what's interesting to me is that while the Congress in Brazil has not come out with really new regulation in the last few years around dealing with platforms and election-related contexts, we do have, as you mentioned, Judge de Moraes of Brazil, who was until recently the president of the Superior Electoral Court, and that court just stepping in and developing new policies around synthetic media, disinformation, negative propaganda and ads, and enforcing it and having accounts being suspended and these sorts of things, which has led to this conflict with Elon Musk of late. Different models in that some is going through the kind of more executive and legislature, and others a bit more of a independent kind of maverick almost approach, maybe different forms of democratic legitimacy of these two approaches, but really getting in there and taking policy action on these issues. And I think a lot of other countries, like in Canada, where we're more just trying to update existing laws and figure out how and when do they apply to social media platforms, a bit more incrementalist in approach. So those are some of the areas where I see a lot happening. And interestingly, both the European Commission dust up with Elon Musk, Brazil, our judge, dust up with Elon Musk. You have these incarnations of these two major players in these contests, the government kind of representative and the platform or one type of platform representative.
Yeah, and Musk is the specter in both of the kind of conflict with the EU, where I think it's fair to say that Gary Berton has made a couple of missteps in the last bit in terms of his kind of confrontational stance or posture towards Elon Musk. Jonathan, you're following Brazil closely. I don't know if you're following the Musk aspect of it, but anything to add on the situation in Brazil for the listeners?
I can say that I think there's other folks in the room also who are like Brazil experts. But on that front, I think what we learned a lot from the Brazil case, coming from the Philippine side, is just how their coalitions were methodologically diverse. While the kind of tools and tech-first mindset is applied to a lot of Asian countries. It's like very top-down. You apply if you want to collaborate with platforms and be enlisted as third-party fact-checkers. Here are your benefits. And for researchers, here are the terms of engagement with us. While in Brazil, like the coalitions were much more open-minded in terms of the different kinds of ways in which they could operationalize platform accountability. So within civil society, and I think it's a big important theme to talk about within global majority countries, we depend a lot on the global north for our funding, from philanthropies, from US, Canada, Australia, through foreign aid, but also from platforms themselves. And I think a lot of the programming of philanthropies and aid from foreign governments just replicate what platforms are already doing. It is about fact-checking. It is about debunking. It is this kind of tools-first mindset. And they treat the Global South as like ways in which to apply and test like databases and debunk. So they would be like, hey, apply these tools. We have developed it here. We could also export it elsewhere after testing it in your elections. And so some like really strong activists, very critical researchers, like all their energy and time is just fulfilling these debunks of 1,000 word papers, fact checks, right? Like some community organizers who are very good at mobilizing grassroots communities, their attention and energies are diverted to these kinds of very tools-based applications. And I think that's something we need to call out. Another theme, and I wanted to just jump into the topic around shaming and shaming platforms, right? And I think that's also important to think about, like how to responsibly do that, and how to mindfully, critically do that. So again, coming from a global majority perspective, there's ways in which some of the shaming aspect and like these theatrical rituals, and those are very important to do. But when the global majority gets cited in some of this, it is as a site of digital horrors and digital dystopia. Look at, obviously, we need to call that out. Obviously, we need to call out Facebook and how it abetted genocide in Myanmar, for example. But there's ways in which the narrative plays out that it sees the global majority as just a digital dystopia that is used to justify global north priorities. And so it's used to like advocate for privacy, for example. Again, good that we are advocating for that. Probably not the biggest priority for some global majority countries. Yeah, and thinking about like how we do some of these revelations, right? For example, the Facebook files. Frances Hogan like disclosing Facebook files, and that's important to like showcase what platforms think the harms are around the world, especially with teenagers. There could have been better ways of engaging local journalists, local academics, local stakeholders to take that story forward, rather than also just keep that embargo among global north journalists, right? So there's a ways in which global north policy advocacies just tokenize the global majority, and I think we need to call that out.
One thing that those of us in the global north need to take responsibility for are the people and the economic and political systems that have produced these platforms. We're like, oh, Elon and Brazil and Elon and the EU. And maybe we should probably interrogate the systems that have led us to have billionaires who control the cultural means of production globally. I don't know. That seems like I'm not an economist, but that seems like a problem in terms of like, where does the accountability actually lie? It's these, you know what I mean? In particular, the US's political and economic systems that have created these behemoths that are doing all sorts of things.
Yeah, and this is just actually making some points that Jonathan has made in other work, but I think an interesting criticism of the emphasis on fact-checking is that it can improve the information environment, but doesn't necessarily advance accountability either of the platforms or necessarily of the political or economic actors who are driving this stuff. And so one thing that I also like that Jonathan has been doing is looking at strategies, civil society groups in India and Brazil and other countries to really use levers to go after those economic actors involved in the disinformation for hire sector. And that's something that we do some of that, certainly in good journalism in Canada and the US and other places, but we could learn more about the strategies and that tactic.
So Shannon brought this idea of we export our values through our technologies. We're doing that again now with AI and large language models and generative media and synthetic media, the rest of that. You're all looking at that in different ways at the moment. But Shannon, I know you have a project in particular that you're up to. It seems like the kind of narrative winds are shifting around AI and its impact on this election cycle. There's been some stories lately. We haven't seen the nuclear deepfake. Perhaps it's not so big a deal, and maybe all those shrimp Jesus memes and various other kind of memes of Trump and Harris and various other political figures. I think folks just don't know what to make of it. What do you make of LLMs in the election cycle?
Yeah. Before I get into the specific project, I do think that we're seeing this pattern repeat that we have seen just over and over again, which is like a moral panic around some new technology. And so I'll just say that so that we've said it, because that's what was happening. But I also think that, like many other technological moral panics before generative AI, it really undercuts the, I think, like respect that we should have for like people. Like no one believed the like Swifties for Trump Gen AI like campaign. Like no one, even if you are a person who might want that to be true, that's not true. So I think it really undercuts the sort of intelligence and sophistication of people who also live and exist in the digital world that we're all in. But I think one of the things that there has been was this going to be the LLM or generative AI election? In some ways it may be, but just not in the ways that we're thinking about it. One of the things that some of these tools are really good at is doing like really boring behind the scenes campaign work, like better organizing your CSV. You know what I mean? Helping to come up with like alternative wording for some part of your speech because you got to give the same speech in like 30 different counties across 40 days. I think politicians and campaigns should be transparent about that, but these are not things that we necessarily need to have like a huge fear about, right? There's probably a lot of that. I know there's a fair amount of that going on in campaigns. And so in some ways it may be, but just not in this sort of like panicked way that we thought it may be. But one of the things that I've been trying to look at is, as people, I think are both some people, but also I think the press and critical world are really focused on things like LLMs like ChatGPT. I've been doing like an audit of what happens if you ask ChatGPT about stuff about elections or particular candidates. What's the quality of that information? I also study journalism. So I can tell you the quality of the information is not super duper great because the training data is not super duper great. And so we're just seeing the same things repeated. And when you do something like force ChatGPT to take the 7-paragraph answer it gave you, really hedging on voter fraud, and say, okay, but is voter fraud a problem in the US? Yes or no? Or can you tell me in one sentence? Then it gets much worse, right? Do I think tons of people are using this right now for like election information? No, right? Like we're not there yet, but I think it's important to see what the quality of that looks like. And one of the things that we had talked about before, and one of the things that I think is perhaps a concern is the uncertainty of the post-election period, both in this country and as we've seen in other countries, because this data, even at its not great level in terms of what we would hope for from a democratic perspective of the input data, it's also a little bit slower than we might like it to be in terms of responding to things that are happening in the moment. And so we may, to the extent that this is a driving force and for people getting information. And then the very last thing I would say about this is that it very heavily US and English language focused. Colleagues of ours at the Reuters Institute at Oxford did a pretty simple, but I think really important, where they just, ahead of the European Parliament, EU elections, asked some pretty simple questions in different languages, countries who were involved in the elections. And most of them didn't do very well, right? Because these models are not necessarily have the same sophistication in terms of training data and then in terms of output in non-English languages. And so there's a slew of my concerns and thoughts. And
so much to get into on this subject. One thing that I keep thinking about generative AI in this election cycle is that it may be the generative AI election, but in terms of it being used for content moderation, and we don't actually know that necessarily which platforms are doing those types of experiments at the moment, but we do lots of vendors that are working for the big platforms are selling those services. But Chris, you've been looking at this issue too.
Yeah. Like Shannon, I think on the one hand, we haven't seen the generative AI as mind control device that could overcome people's willpower and convince them of something they wouldn't otherwise believe. And we probably should never have expected that. On the other hand, I think the last year of elections, we've seen all kinds of experimentation in pretty problematic uses of the technology. And so in our report, we point out 3 categories. One is increasing the cost of accessing good information. And one way that might happen is if you're going to a chatbot and asking questions about when do I register, how do I vote, and if you're getting wrong information there. And we do know from some of these audits of these systems that happens. That's one way it can be more costly to access good information. Also, just like information system pollution, because these systems are good at generating large amounts of content. And in the French election, we saw there is TikTok campaigns with these thousands of videos with AI generated narration of them. So like these kind of flooding concerns. Another area is the deceptive use. Part of that is concerns around targeted messaging and getting better at that. But the deepfake question is a big one. And we did see the Joe Biden voice cloning deepfake, which is, it didn't have much impact, but that is exactly what we're worried about. Close to a voting fake of a candidate telling you to do something that would change maybe your behavior in it. That's concerning. And then a third category is about harassment and intimidation of individuals. And the generative AI technologies have been used for a long time to create sexualized images of women in particular. And that is something that is being used in politics. And in the UK, there was an investigation not long ago, just before their election, where they found a site that was hosting hundreds of synthetic images of women in British politics, sexualized images. Yeah, so experimentation and stuff we don't want these technologies to be doing. And so on the one hand, I think we need to avoid the kind of alarmism and say, and throw up your hands, we're never going to know the truth or who won that election, so we should despair and distrust our institutions. But on the other hand, I think there's a lot to be concerned about. And in the report, we also set out some recommendations for a range of actors, because it isn't just the AI companies or just the platforms that have to have a role.
Jonathan, maybe just slight, I don't want to call it a tangent, but maybe a bit of a detour from Chris's comments on the role of generative AI in elections. I want to ask you about something I know you want to talk about tonight, which is a piece you wrote for Tech Policy Press on the Pentagon's efforts to use disinformation tactics, including fake accounts and, I believe, GAN-generated images for profiles and things of that nature. So tell us why you think this topic is relevant to tonight's discussion and what you're concerned about.
Yeah. So first of all, it's a paper I wrote for Tech Policy Press for Justin. It is about how the Pentagon ran an anti-vax campaign in various countries in Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. So it was discrediting the Chinese vaccine from 2020 to 2020, from 2021 to mid 2022. So it ran for 18 months. And I wanted to talk about it because I'm curious whether people have heard about it. And number two, whether people are people researching it? Because like when revelations of like Russian interference happens or Chinese interference happens, you have all the researchers writing a paper. You have a fucking graphical report published. Where is the graphical report for this one? So we want to know, Philippines is one of those targeted countries. So the Reuters revealed this in a report from sometime in May, I believe. It contained examples of hashtags that were approved by the Pentagon. And so it was textual. They consulted Facebook, they consulted Twitter. So it was a multi-platform campaign across different countries. So to discredit China's vaccine diplomacy at the height of COVID. So we didn't have access to Moderna or Pfizer. So we only had access to China's Sinovac vaccine. And so they were discrediting China, trying to be cozy to our governments. And so they listed and showed several memes and hashtags that they traced back to the Pentagon. But on top of that, the journalists were able to also get revelations from actual military whistleblowers and also state diplomats. So both who were for the campaign and so those who justified the campaign, and the Pentagon was like, but the Chinese are running an operations against us, so we have to fight that. So that's their justification. But the report also included pushback from state diplomats. So they were also saying, hey, we learned about this and we tried to push it back, but we couldn't. I think it's a very good, important revelation. And I think more researchers should be looking at it and be more indignant about it and demand more accountability. And I think there were some leftover clues in the investigation from Reuters, including that Facebook had a meeting with the Pentagon. Facebook figured it out and called the Pentagon to say, hey, we can trace this back to you guys. Please take it down. And the Pentagon said, oh, can you not? And it looks like they allowed the accounts to play out. But it begs the question, right? Did they inform policy officers in the targeted countries. Who else knew about it? At what level of the platforms did these decisions get made? And so I think we need to hold platforms accountable, but also the Pentagon accountable. Yeah.
Has anyone told Jim Jordan about this?
I don't think, by the way, this is the first time that independent researchers have discovered Pentagon or military disinformation campaigns and then brought it to the attention of the platforms. And this question of why the platforms would likely have known about it and allowed it to persist for so long. So some deep questions here. By the way, just credit where it's due, Chris being Joel Shechtman at Reuters, and the report was filed on June 14th of 2024.
It's a really great report, and I'm sure that it took a lot of bravery for them to get this out, and I think we need to follow up on it.
Great. So I'm going to pause now for questions from the room. Maybe if you'll raise a hand here, Robin Kaplan.
All right, I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts on the issue of trust when it comes to both kind of social media and Gen AI. So there's been some studies that have been happening, for long-term studies that have looked at declines in trust in various institutions, and it's shown that trust in institutions has been declining since trust has been measured since the 1970s. There was a report that was done by Josh Tucker at CITAP that kind of redid the same thing and looked at trust in technology companies as well. And that report showed that trust in technology companies was decreasing at even a more rapid rate than trust in any of these other institutions. So I'm curious about your thoughts about where this interacts with generative AI and the information that people are getting from it. So if we are trusting media less and we are trusting technology less, and this technology is being developed and deployed probably for it should be, isn't this a feedback loop of distrust? Likely is it that people will even trust this information?
Yeah, we've got a whole industry that has coined this kind of sub-industry, trust and safety, right? Which is intended to address some of these issues. I find that to be very interesting. Sometimes just thinking about those words. But what do you all think of Robin's question?
I think it's a great one. I think that obviously we have a trust problem, let's say, wave our hands and say we're at large. But I also think the reason, though, that we might still be concerned, right, about some of these things is because, yes, people are not having trust in institutions or media companies or technology companies, but they have trust in individuals, and identity plays a huge role in that, right? And so it's not necessarily, did I see this on Facebook and was it real or was it not real? You know what I mean? In terms of, again, I think people really can tell if something is fully Gen AI, especially visually. Who created it? Why? In terms of what does it do for you as the consumer of that? And I think that's where we should be worried. That's why we might still be concerned about some of these things. People do not writ large trust things on social media platforms any more than they do almost anywhere else. You know what I mean? They might see it, but people do trust messengers, and they particularly trust in-group messengers, right? So people who are like them in particular ways that are important to them. And you and everyone, and yourself and myself included, have trusted things that have come from people we trust because they tend to be like us in particular ways that are important to us, and those things have been wrong. I think that's why we're still concerned about some of these things, even though when we ask people about trust at these larger scales of like institutions or even types of companies, it's not very high. But those things are just the conduit for these more identity-based communication tactics, which all of these technologies and media play a role in.
Yeah, and adding on that, I think that distrust can, on the one hand, lead to a healthy skepticism about material so that you don't immediately fall for something. We don't. Take the time, find other information sources, perhaps, and decide then what to do. I think some of the really challenging uses of these technologies are in situations where there isn't as much time, or we have these problems of access to good information where that next move of finding better information to correct it might be harder to pursue. And so in terms of one of these pretty dramatic uses of these technologies and a bit more of a security one, but is those situations where you're impersonating like a bank manager's voice and someone has to make a decision right then and there. Does this sound like could be? And then you've acted. So that kind of distrust doesn't have time to lead to better kind of media behaviors. And I think that's also where the harassment issue we really highlight in our report, because it doesn't need to be believed by other people to be harmful. And there's been really powerful testimonies by politicians from AOC to others about the immediate impact of seeing oneself portrayed in these ways, that it, I think, makes it, particularly harmful.
I feel like that aspect of generative AI, and AOC has been an amazing leader on talking about this as a phenomenon. I feel like there's not enough being looked at there, and the extent to which kind of core aspects of our trust of our communities is broken down. Issues like non-consensual intimate imagery and the like, and the other kind of fraud that's being perpetrated with voice cloning and other things. We have room for one more question in the room.
My question is actually built on, I think, the trust questions related to that, but it's something I certainly struggle with, and many do, is how do you, if you're looking forward strategically at law and policy solutions, how to move the agenda forward? We're in an environment of increased polarization. And I'm finding more and more often, especially right now in the Canadian context, as we have a few pretty important pieces of legislation on our plate, that the conversation is strategically, we just need to not get into the nuance. We know that it's there and we have to dig into those pieces, but it just makes you vulnerable to just it being picked up by all this polarization. Yet we all know how incredibly complicated this area is, and also that it often involves pretty hard choices. Some of it's practical for where we're at right now. Some of it is just you have to make a decision in that moment. And so I'd be really keen to hear any thoughts and advice that you have in your journeys in working in this field and how you would navigate that.
Offhand, I can just think about if the proposed solution is like overly blunt and like context agnostic, like it could deal greater harms. It could do more harm than actual good, especially in global majority countries. Listening to your conversation around like trust in platforms and trust in other institutions, for civil society organizations in many global majority countries would rather have an open line with the platforms rather than be called by our governments. Like we would feel more at risk, like to be sitting in front of our legislator, right? Like, and being asked for that testimony. And I've been in that position myself. And so that's a very tricky position where the government is actually the bad actor in the room, would rather like collaborate in a critical way with platforms and see what buttons we can press when engaging with them, but still having that critical distance, right? I think that nuance is important. I think I wouldn't want to sacrifice some of that nuance. And there's many examples where even like UNESCO releasing guidelines for regulating digital platforms, I think about a year ago, and a group of Southeast Asian civil society organizations gathered under the hashtag Pushback UNESCO, because like the set of guidelines were empowering governments to do more regulation of content like in their countries. And had you talked to us, Southeast Asian civil society, we would be the first to tell you that this would lead us to a bad place. And so I think those disconnects where the global north and global majority would diverge in terms of their priorities or advocacies and their evidence. I think it's important to dwell on that and really understand when that divergence happens. And therefore, it's important also who gets to speak for the global majority. Because in some ways, again, it's a very kind of, and even sometimes if it's a global majority activist, we would tend to just echo what is like an accepted frame for us to be legible and to be heard. And I think that's challenging.
So I think it's really important that and I'm not going to say this is easy, but I think it's really important that we try to understand who in government, in civil society, in society, et cetera, are acting in good faith and who's acting in bad faith. because there are people, as Jonathan was just mentioning, and in our country here too, using the levers of government to do anti-democratic things right under this guise, right, of it being government action. I've been harassed by organizations that would be labeled a civil society organization, right? And so I think it's really important that as we're trying to figure these things out, we call it a spade. And when organizations or governments or people are acting in bad faith, even if they say we're this type of organization or we're a senator or MP or whatever, that we don't engage with that as if it is a good faith effort to engage in a democratic, small d democratic future. Because I think that what can happen when we try to do that too much is that then we lose any sense of what is the moral compass of what is it that we are actually trying to do. And I think that's what underlies. I'm not a law scholar, a legal scholar, but in the reading that I've done in that area, there's a huge normative, right? Like it's normatively based, right? And I've tried to pull our field more in that direction and having this normative core things, as have many of my colleagues here. And I think, though, that then it's really important then for us to keep that as we're using our own research or our own analysis and encourage others to keep that, those normative commitments and core and not engage with folks, because you can, I think this nuance that you're talking about, I don't know, I think I see this, an example that I can think of is I feel like in the US mainstream media, there's all this hand-wringing about having lost the conservative audience members. And we've seen different organizations try and make different moves to do that. But the core of the conservative movement in the US, part of the core identity markers is anti-media. So no matter what you do, it just is moving the goalposts further. And I see that as very similar to sort of like a person who's in an abusive relationship, right? No matter what you do, it is not enough. And the goalpost keeps getting moved. And so I do think it's important to have and hard to have this sort of nuance around things, but I also think it's really important to sometimes kind of say, fuck nuance, right? And call out what is actually happening, even when it's really hard and difficult. Because I think if we keep moving the goalpost towards things that may be acceptable to policymakers across political divides, some of those political divides are real and can be bridged, but some political divides are not in good faith, and trying to bridge them actually, I think, takes us much further from where we would like to be as healthy societies.
Slightly different approach to that question of trust. And I think accountability, it strikes me that in addition to nuance, I think real clarity around standards and expectations and then actual enforcement of them is both important for dealing with specific harms and helps build kind of trust in the larger, whether it's democratic institutions or media institutions. And as a point of comparison, we had the Joe Biden voice cloning in New Hampshire. Fairly quickly, we know who it was. The FCC was pursuing charges. That's one situation. Contrasting one, in Slovakia last year, we had this voice cloning of misrepresenting what a candidate for presidential office said on the eve of elections, possibly a Russia-aligned campaign. Who knows? But we don't really know who did it. No one's been held to account. And in that situation, how do you know what to believe or what institutions to trust? I think clarity, including normative clarity, is really important. And then non-arbitrary action on it.
We're going to draw things to a close. This has been a good discussion. I guess the one thing I'd say about it is that it's gone in many different directions, and there's a lot of complexity here, geographical complexity, issue complexity, et cetera. But one thing I hope we've done is maybe got slightly past the trope of, it's a year of elections, what do we do? But just as a 30-second way of closing out, when we're past this year of elections, past 2024, of course, there'll be elections elsewhere in 2025, but what do you think your research agenda will be in 2025, 2026? What do you think is the big question that you want to ask once we get past this year?
I'll just continue what I'm doing, which is the coalition building work and what makes for an effective coalition, but also what makes for an ethical and just way of working. And I think to understand and have that more sharp analytics in terms of what is an extractive way of working with your collaborators, especially when it comes to collaborations where there's big power inequalities and power distances. I think that's important to really understand for us to get to nuance and complexity.
Shannon.
I want to research like how sea turtles talk to each other. I don't know. I'm really tired. That's my research agenda after 2024.
You the TikTok series.
Yeah. No, I think that one of the things, I'm not going to do that. I'm a fighty person, so I'm not going to stop. I think that what I'm really interested in is in 2024 in the US, we have this national election. And what I'm really interested in after that is really diving into my own geographical space and the politics and communication around that, which is the US South, and in particular, North Carolina, where I live and where I work, and bringing to bear my research lens into a more sort of geographically contained space that I think is on the front lines of a lot of issues that we're talking about in this country, but I also think globally.
Yeah, if you want to study authoritarianism, you don't have to go very far.
Anything in the US South, basically.
Yeah. I'm very interested in continuing to learn from different countries and regions' approaches to things. I've learned so much already from this group on that. And continuing on this accountability direction, the elections are happening, the misuses of platforms and maybe platform problematic behavior have happened, but there's going to be some time of investigations and legal processes and really figuring out what works and what doesn't in terms of protecting democratic institutions and holding to account those who are trying to undermine them.
I want to thank all of you. I want to thank the audience, and I'm going to give you all a round of applause for enjoying this humid night.
That's it for this episode. I hope you'll send your feedback. You can write to me at justin@techpolicy.press. Thanks to Chris Tenove and to Molly Loss at SSRC. Thanks to my co-founder Brian Jones, and thank you for listening.
Tech Policy Press.